Okay. Number 3 we're going to talk about is sensitive data exposure. For an overview, sensitive data, what is it? Any data that includes passwords, credit card numbers, health records, personal or business secrets, anything you just wouldn't want being out there in the public or just posted publicly on a dark web website for sale or something. It also includes data that falls under certain privacy laws that you should be aware of. HIPAA is applicable if you are storing health records or managing any health records. PCI DSS if you're doing any kind of financial data, credit card processing or something like that in your web app. GDPR applies for Europe only, but I've noticed that a lot of websites that are global, they also comply with GDPR just globally, not just for European users, because it's easier to just implement it for everybody and it's safer. There's also something called CCPA, which is California specific. It's similar to GDPR. I think it's actually a little more strict than GDPR, but those are totally different topics that you can research. They're kind of outside of the scope of this presentation, but just know that that data that falls under those privacy laws should be protected, encrypted, and whatnot. Data must be protected in transit as well as in the database where it's stored, or if it doesn't have to be a database, it could be memory where it's stored. It should always be protected like with encryption somehow. Also, think about how certain data is to be compromised, or how certain data can be compromised in the web browser. So that's sort of a third vector in addition to transit and stored in the database. You can also store data in certain places in the web browser. Think of cookies and cache. For example, you don't want to store anything sensitive in a cookie because obviously you can just open the developer tools in a user could open the developer tools in their browser and they can see that sensitive information. In this example, just a username isn't that sensitive, but if there's anything in here like a password, a social security number, credit card number, that data can potentially be leaked from your cookies to a malicious attacker by a lot of different methods. There's many, many ways for them to get a hold of your cookies. But if you do have to store anything in there, make sure that it's done right and follow best practices and guidelines. And talking about the different places that sensitive data exposure needs to be taken into consideration. First, there's in transit. As I said, data may be encrypted in the database, and that's all well and good, but when it's taken out of that database and being worked on by your program, it's decrypted. And so if your program is sending it over the network, it's also decrypted over the network by default. So you need to make sure that it's encrypted in transit as well. Even if your app and database are both on a private network, like a local area network, on your cloud provider service or something, don't assume that that network is safe and that there isn't a potentially malicious user watching. It's just another layer of security. Just make sure that things in transit are always encrypted. That's the best practice. And looking at when sensitive data is stored, like on a database or in memory, you need to make sure that it's encrypted. Because obviously if you just encrypt everything going over the network and in transit, it's still eventually going to be stored somewhere in the database. So if you don't protect it there, it can be viewed in clear text by a malicious attacker and make their job a lot easier. As I said before, the end user's local cache and cookies are also considered a type of database of information. So you need to also check that area for anything sensitive. The impact of sensitive data exposure can vary a lot, from impersonation to money laundering, social security fraud, unemployment fraud, and a lot of these are the same as broken authentication that we just talked about before. But ID theft, classified information leak, as I said, the same as number 2 in a lot of cases. Another thing to think about is that if you don't take action to prevent certain information from getting into the hands of attackers, you might be out of compliance if you're not encrypting data in transit or in the database at rest. You may be out of compliance and incur any penalty fees or even legal action from users or government agencies. So be careful with that. You might end up in the news. You might also lose trust in your user base, which is pretty bad because then your user count goes down and people start uninstalling your app or not going to your website because they might not trust you. It's also important to talk about auditing for sensitive data exposure. You can have all the protections in the world, but it's always good practice to audit yourself or hire a contractor or a security firm to do this for you. And what I mean by that is actually using a tool such as TCP dump, that's a Linux command line tool, or Wireshark, which is a Windows and Linux tool that has a graphical interface. And these tools can be used for sniffing traffic over the network. And it's pretty easy, scary easy to use these. All you need is a network jack or a wireless connection to a network, anything like that. And you can view all the traffic there floating back and forth between clients and servers. You want to be looking for clear text strings. So the picture here on this slide is somewhat realistic, only in that you'll see a lot of what looks like gibberish, not necessarily ones and zeros, but you'll see a lot of other characters that don't make any sense and not real words because it's encrypted. But if you use something like Wireshark or TCP dump and then just search all of the packets you capture, sniffing the network for just the term password, in a lot of cases you can just find where you'll see in a packet password equals so-and-so, and then you just look at elsewhere in the packet and find the username, and boom, you've got a username and password compromised. That happens all the time. And it actually happened at a previous employer of mine where I was working several years ago. Shortly after starting with the company, I had some downtime and thought I would just run Wireshark on my computer, my workstation, and see what I could see. I ended up finding passwords for the entire IT department and all the executives, just flying back and forth between workstations and the server in clear text. It was pretty bad, and that was a medium-sized business too, with several thousand employees around the country. Obviously, that got a lot of attention, and we fixed that as soon as we possibly could. Talking about prevention of sensitive data exposure, you want to classify your data in your app. You need to determine the sensitivity of each piece of data. For example, you can create your own labeling system, but this is kind of the most common used is public, confidential, and restricted. So public obviously would just be information you don't care who gets it, who gets their hands on it. It doesn't contain anything sensitive and isn't going to lead to an attack. Confidential might mean just internal policies. You might not want those being out in the public for obvious reasons. People can use that knowledge to their advantage. Or restricted, like proprietary company secrets that are extra protected that require, say, executive access or C-level access. Only collect data what you need, and this is really important. The less data you collect, the less you have to worry about keeping secure. It's as simple as that. So you can have the most vulnerable website in the world if you're not collecting any data from users and the website isn't connected to anything else where it can be used as an attack vector to your network. There isn't really any risk in just putting that out there. But if you're collecting data, especially something that falls under compliance area like HIPAA, GDPR, PCI DSS, you need to make sure that you have a way of keeping it secure. That's very important. And it's as simple as just encrypting that data, like I said, in transit and at rest in storage in the database. Okay. For data in transit, you may already know this, but use HTTPS everywhere possible. What that means is just looking up in the address bar of when you're viewing your website. You want to make sure that on no pages of your website, you're using just HTTP where you don't have that S there. That means that it's not secure. It's just over, it's being sent and received in plain text over your network. So that might be okay if, like I said, you're not collecting any sensitive data whatsoever or user data or anything, and your app is just a little informational page about something. That might not be a big deal at all. Who cares? But if you're collecting user data, make sure it's over HTTPS. For data at rest, use tried and true algorithms. Don't use the newest edge kind of encryption algorithm or cipher that hasn't been well tested or peer reviewed in the industry. Use something that's been around a while, that's been really, really, really heavily tested and peer reviewed. AES is Advanced Encryption Standard, and ECC is Ecliptic Cryptography. RSA, I don't remember what that one stands for. It's the last name of the 3 people who invented it, and that was back in the 90s, so it's been around a very long time too. But those are the 3 ones you want to look for if you're using encryption. There are many different types though. This is not an inclusive set. For further reading, see the OWASP cryptographic storage sheet for seeing how to protect your data at rest, and the OWASP transport layer protection cheat sheet for protecting your data in transit, and the OWASP password storage cheat sheet if you're storing passwords in your database.